and that warms our heart. And yes, Alexis has just pressed the button to record. So tell your friends that aren't here tonight that they can see this on YouTube at a later date. Let me introduce Derrick Pratt, who is the Director of Education and Public Programming for the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse. It's been a while, Derrick, I have to confess, since I've been to your canal museum, but it is an impressive place, and I definitely recommend to all of you that if you haven't seen it or haven't seen it lately, make a trip. You're not far from Dinosaur Barbecue. You can make a day of it. Um, as I said, Derrick is the director of the education and public programming part of the museum. He came to the museum with a bachelor's from SUNY Cortland in history education and some experience working in the Chittenango Erie Canal Museum. And his master's is in museum studies from Syracuse University. And this presentation is one of a series that his department has available to the community. They do live presentations and they do Zoom and Facebook presentations. So do if you're an educator or have interest in more material about this, please get in touch with Derrick and see about having him come and speak to your group. Um, we just picked this Beery Canal because it was such an intriguing subject, and who doesn't like beer?
Right.
So, Derrick,
We've all got mugs, I know now.
yeah, well, we got to keep them wet.
Yes.
Derrick, whenever you are ready, we're ready for you.
All right. Well, great. Thanks. And thanks for having me and for all of you for joining us tonight. If you haven't been to the museum before, it is a fun place to go. Right now is a great time. We're in the middle of our 40th annual gingerbread gallery, where about 40 local central New Yorkers, ranging from like little kids to professional bakers, produce these really wonderful gingerbread creations. But that's not why I'm here to talk to you today. Today we're going to talk about beer and more broadly alcohol and its connections to the Erie Canal. Because the Erie Canal is going to have a huge impact on beer production in New York State, especially. But you'll see this is also a national tale as well. But to understand how the Erie Canal is going to change things, we have to go back in time to before there was an Erie Canal. Our story really begins around 10 to 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. As the glaciers began to recede, you have what's known as Great Lake Iroquois formed, which is Lake Ontario plus Oneida Lake, as well as the tops even of Cayuga and Seneca lakes. Um, and this giant glacial lake, nowadays, all of those bodies of water I mentioned, they drain out to the ocean via the St. Lawrence River. However, at the time, there's still giant, glaciers on top of the St. Lawrence. So that water needed to find a new route to the ocean. And it did that right here in the Mohawk River Valley and the Hudson River Valley, carving out this canyon that made an ideal transportation route, especially once that lake receded and it left behind a lot of natural bodies of water that we're familiar with today in upstate New York. It's right around the same time that this lake exists. The first human beings in what is today New York start arriving. Over time, uh, they'll take advantage of these natural waterways to form the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, on whose land the Erie Canal is mostly going to be built across. They take advantage of these natural transportation routes to form this really powerful group between, pretty much the Niagara River and the Hudson. However, The Haudenosaunee do not have much of a drinking culture. Alcohol doesn't really arrive in New York until the arrival of Europeans in the 1600s, when the Dutch show up in the Hudson River Valley. The Dutch would bring with them a strong drinking culture. Um, they also recognize the importance of this natural passageway through the mountains. And this is important to note, just the different waves of settlement because different cultures drink different alcohols. The Dutch like beer. They primarily drink beer and whiskey. If you go to the State Museum today in Albany, you can actually see one of the earliest um, casks of beer in the New Netherland colony at the New York State Museum, recently dug up in some archaeology. So there's a lot of brewing going on there in Albany and New York City, essentially, and more Dutch settlers, as well as German and some early English settlers, move in the Hudson Valley, as well as into the Mohawk. And while the Hudson River is a great river to transport things on, less so the Mohawk. While this passageway is the only passage under 600 feet in elevation through the Appalachian Mountains, there's still a lot of waterfalls and rapids on the Mohawk. But the Dutch do recognize, as do other European colonists later on, ideal climates and geography for producing alcohol. The Mohawk Valley, as well as the Genesee Valley, are both wide and fertile, well, relatively fertile valleys, great for growing wheat in, which you need to make things like whiskey. Meanwhile, out in the Finger Lakes, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, an ideal microclimate for growing grapes, which are, of course, necessary for wine. Then the microclimate along the shores of Lake Ontario are great for growing fruit and fruit trees, which you need to build to grow, to make hard cider. And then the hills of especially central New York uh, have the ideal elevation and temperature and rainfall for hops, which you, of course, need for beer. Um, so lots of opportunities to produce alcohol. However, the way that the Mohawk naturally operates with its waterfalls and rapids, it's not an ideal river for transportation. So all of this great land for agriculture is really hard to access. So mostly farmers who settle in the Mohawk Valley, they're only producing alcohol for at-home consumption. They can't profitably send it to market. Um, with the American Revolution, you have the Sullivan Clinton campaign in 1779, in which American armies attacked the Haudenosaunee around the Finger Lakes. This is devastating to the Haudenosaunee, but it gives this justification the land has been quote unquote cleared. And you can see on this map, the land gets divided up into the military tracts afterwards, given to Revolutionary War veterans as payment for their service. So more and more settlers start moving into central New York. I forgot to mention, 1660s, the British take over from the Dutch. They have different drinking habits. Rather than beer, the British at this time prefer brandy and rum. So beer, large scale beer production kind of goes away during the era of colonial New York. But then after the revolution, as more and more settlers start moving into central New York, they start demanding better access to markets as they start establishing farms in these regions. Finally, pressure mounts enough that New York State decides to build the Erie Canal, beginning July 4th, 1817, and completed in 1825. And alcohol will play a critical role in the construction of the Erie Canal. Here you can see one of the more dangerous parts of the work This is Lockport out on the western end. But the way workers were paid in digging the canal, so the idea of just being kind of paid wages isn't fully established in America yet. We're kind of in the midst of the sort of capitalist revolution that creates industrialism and everything. Um, a lot of people are still operating on kind of more feudal systems of um, exchange. And paternalistic ones. So a lot of workers digging the canal. They're also on the frontier, so cash is relatively hard to find, are paid in kind. So they are given places to sleep, food to eat, and also critically, whiskey to drink. Canal historian Peter Way estimates that the average canal laborer was paid between 10 and 15 ounces of whiskey a day while on the job. As you can imagine, that didn't make for the safest working conditions. Um, but there was also a saying at the time that no one would dig a canal sober because it is backbreaking work, as you can see here. There are also some tall tales from the canal, unsubstantiated ones, that canal contractors, when they needed to make a deadline, for instance, would place barrels of whiskey at the location that they wanted canal laborers to dig to. And yeah, once they reached that point, they could enjoy the contents of the barrel. That was these sorts of inducements allowed the canal to be constructed in a mere 8 years. Also, while the canal was being built, this was a huge gamble by New York State. They invest over $7 million, roughly one-third of the state's GDP at the time, into building the canal. And it takes 8 years to build. Um, However, they open parts incrementally. So the middle division between Montezuma and Utica is actually open by 1820. And the canal reduces shipping costs, however, not so much that bulk goods like grain could be profitably shipped to market. However, like we discussed, you can turn grains into more high value goods, namely whiskey. So some of the earliest taxes assessed on the canal are for whiskey, and they help to keep the canal afloat, if you will, for a couple of years. Um, and as soon as the Erie Canal starts opening up, um, breweries also begin opening as well. One of the earliest ones along the route of the canal is in Rochester in 1819. You have the Aqueduct Spring Brewing Company formed. Meanwhile, out in Albany, an English immigrant by the name of John Taylor would open in the early 1820s. His brewery, which is in a very ideal location, it is essentially at the corner of the Hudson River and the Erie Canal. Put a pin in that brewery. It will come back later. Meanwhile, at the western end of the canal, Buffalo gets its first brewery a year before the canal opens in 1824, when Kane, Peacock, and Relay open. Um, this is an interest. This may have a canal connection, and it's hard to find a lot of information on this particular brewery, but you may have noticed the kind of unique name in there, Peacock, which is the last name of a Buffalo-based canal engineer as well as his relatively large family. So most likely, someone who was related to the canal at least was founding that. Meanwhile, in Syracuse, the Erie Canal Museum's hometown, 1824 is when we get our first brewery as well. And it's listed on this 1834 map. It is the brewery of Kellogg and Morey, and that is located right here, right on the Erie Canal, because it's ideal to place your brewery on the canal. Most of these breweries are. It provides the most efficient way of shipping your goods. But this brewery is located on the canal and right next to Onondaga Creek, allowing for a fresh source of water as well. And this location we'll be coming back to multiple times during this talk. Um, it will be very important in the history of Central New York brewing overall. And once the canal opens, you see a reduction in travel time between Buffalo and New York City from about 1 month to about 1 week, while shipping costs are reduced from about $100 a ton to less than $10 a ton. This is enormous. Tons of goods, literally tons of goods, will be shipped down the canal. These towns will become boom towns, places like Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. And as thousands of people settle on the banks of the canal, a lot of them are looking for a drink. We'll talk a bit more about how they consumed alcohol later. But within 20 years of the Erie Canal opening, New York goes from having practically zero um, commercial breweries in the state to, in 1845, there would be 102 breweries throughout New York. In 1845, marks a major turning point in beer production as well um, in New York State. Um, because during the 1840s, you will see a large wave of immigration come to the canal corridor. As soon as the Erie Canal opens up, thousands of immigrants will travel down the canal, settling in canal communities and working on the canal, as well as moving into the Great Lakes Basin. A great example can be seen here in this image from a German language newspaper in our collection. This shows the German community in Buffalo, right on the banks of the Erie Canal. And the 1840s are a huge decade for immigration to America. There is a uh, tumultuous decade in Europe. You have the Great Famine in Ireland, though also the potato blight that causes that. Exists throughout most of Western Europe. So there's great hunger throughout the country. This is kind of a pushing factor. You also have in 1848 um, the springtime of the peoples, as it's called, or the revolutions of 1848, when especially in Central Europe, the Germanic speaking countries um, rise up to try to overthrow absolute monarchs in favor of more kind of modern liberal democracies. They end up being brutally crushed um, later in 1848 and 49, which causes a lot of immigration as well, fleeing from political persecution. And so, from these two stories I just mentioned, you see a large influx of Irish and German immigrants to New York and into the Canal Corridor. And both of these cultures bring with them their own distinct beer drinking um, tastes. So previously, most of these breweries growing up along the canal, those 100 or so that grow up after the canal opens in the first 2 decades, they're mainly producing English style beers. Those would largely be ales. Um, the Irish, though, prefer darker beers, porters, and stouts, while the Germans prefer a completely different style of beer entirely. That is lager beers. And these German and Irish communities grow to such an extent that they all form enough of a market for these beers to be brewed in these canal communities. So, starting in the 1840s, New York really enters a golden age of beer production. Um, Between 1840 and 1900, New York State will grow more hops and brew more beer than anywhere else in the country. And we'll start out with hops. Pictured here are a group of people in southern Madison County harvesting hops. The counties of Oneida, Madison, Otsego, and Onondaga counties would at their height produce 80% of all of the nation's hops, peaking in 1880 when they produced 21 million pounds of hops. And hops weren't just big business, which they were. A lot of these canal side towns in the lower lying areas, places like Utica and Syracuse, they would see noticeable reductions in their town populations during the fall as people went up into the hills to harvest hops. It was such a lucrative industry. And the hop harvest was integral to especially central New York culture. You have hop dances, um, and various other hop ceremonies. Hop kings and queens are crowned at the hop dance, etc. In fact, my home county, Madison County, still has a hop fest to this day, though to a much lesser extent. But back in the day, this is where, this was the social occasion of the year, was going out to harvest hops. That's where you're going to meet your, future spouse or something was out at the hop harvest. Um, and all of those hops that they were harvesting, many of them did not travel particularly far. They would go down the hills to these canal side towns that would grow some enormous breweries. If you'll remember that brewery in Albany, founded by John Taylor in the early 1820s. This is it. In the later 1800s, it was at its height the largest brewery in America. It could produce around 200,000 barrels of beer a year. And it takes off in part due to that ideal location. You can see how important this water transport is to the brewery. And the Great Albany Ale Project out in Albany has traced Albany Ale beers ads as far west as Chicago and as far south as South Carolina. So being able to access those two transportation routes of the Erie Canal and the Hudson River sure pays off for Taylor and Sons. In fact, New York State brewing reaches its peak in 1876 when the state boasts 393 breweries. So it was already impressive that between 1825 and 1845, you add around 100 breweries to the state. But within the next 30 years, another 300 breweries would be added to the state's total. Tons and tons of beer were being produced. Buffalo alone in 1870 would boast 41 breweries in that city alone. So, and a lot of them are monsters like this Taylor Brewery, including this one here. This is uh, Greenway's Brewing Company in Syracuse. Um, Here's the brewery. It's a city block long, 7 stories tall, founded in 1852 by English immigrant John Greenway. You can see over here, whoop, uh, your canal boats. It's right there, loading and unloading beer onto boats. It also had access to the railroads at this point in time. And this brewery is actually built in that same location that in 1824, um, the Maury and Kellogg Brewery was established as well. This brewery could produce around 100,000 barrels of beer a year. And like I said, Greenway is an English immigrant just like John Taylor, so they are primarily producing English style ales, as well as porters, too. Interestingly, what's not pictured in this image, because this is from a trade journal, so Greenway's specifically paid to have their picture in here. So they also paid to not show their competing rival brewery that was located on the exact opposite bank of the Erie Canal. It would be in the background here. And this really shows the differences in these different styles of beer, as well as the interesting kind of settlement patterns that occur um, in canal communities, with immigrant communities typically forming their own kind of enclaves and neighborhoods in different areas. And in Syracuse's case, immigrants primarily lived on the north side. The boundary line for the north side was the Erie Canal. Germans primarily live on the north side of the canal. And the brewery, not pictured here, is what was originally Germania Brewing Company. They could produce around 50,000 barrels of lager beer. And they were the second largest of the German breweries in Syracuse alone. Haverly's, farther up on the north side near the Oswego Canal, also produced around 100,000 barrels of beer a year um, in the late 1800s. So, yeah, you've got all of these huge, monstrous breweries growing up along the banks of the canal. But that's also not every brewery along the canal either. Of those, almost 400 breweries in 1876, they're not all producing, 50 to 200,000 barrels annually. A lot of breweries are more local in character, growing up on the banks of the canal to service their local communities or their local regions. A great example of this is a German brewery founded in 1860 by German immigrant Louis Bierbauer, a great name to found a brewery with. He founds the Bierbauer Brewing Company in Canajoharie, New York. And these breweries, especially ones operated by immigrants, offered job opportunities for fellow migrants as well. So we talked about the formation of these often German neighborhoods. Well, a lot of folks would find jobs then at their local breweries. And it was a great way to also, if you were an established immigrant, to kind of give back and help bring your fellow countrymen over as well. And was the case in this Canajoharie based Bierbauer Brewing Company. When Louis Bierbauer hired in 1879 a young German immigrant who had just arrived in town, a man by the name of Francis Xavier Matt. Um, some of you may know where this story is headed there, but FX Matt would learn brewing in Canajoharie at this brewery for about 9 years before moving on to the big city of Utica, where he would found his own West End Brewing Company as well. And that would become a very successful brewery as well. But we've talked a lot about making beer. Now we have to talk a little about consuming it. We already talked about how much alcohol was consumed while digging the canal. And once it opened, a lot more alcohol was consumed on its waters. By 1835, a missionary society traveled the length of the canal and in their report estimated that between Buffalo and Albany, there were approximately 1,500 locations where you could purchase alcohol. That ultimately works out to about 1 bar per quarter of a mile along the 363-mile route of the canal. However, those taverns and what have you are not spread out evenly along the route of the canal. They would often concentrate where canalers would be and would have time to go in and enjoy a drink or two or three, who knows how many. Um, and one of the main places where bars would start to grow up uh, are at locks. Another thing the Erie Canal gives us is the traffic jam. It takes between 10 and 15 minutes to go through a single lock. Um, so um, if you have a number of boats, and there are thousands of boats traveling the canal's waters, um, only one boat can pass through a lock at a time, so you could be stuck waiting at a lock for several hours. With all that time on your hands, businesses catering to that spring up, especially bars. At first, there is a real problem of lock tenders opening up the bars themselves, which caused a lot of issues. There were complaints that bartenders were focusing more on selling beer than or excuse me, lock tenders were focusing more on selling beer than getting boats through the locks, or were getting kind of paid off, forcing canalers to purchase drinks at their bar in order for passage through the locks. This became enough of a problem that New York State actually had to pass a law saying that lock tenders were not allowed to operate businesses at the locks. But nonetheless, there are still plenty of taverns at the locks. The other two major places where, well, the other big place where saloons and taverns, that sort of thing, concentrate are in the major cities and towns along the canal's routes. And no two places were more notorious for that than the two ends of the Erie Canal, Buffalo and the location you see pictured here. This is Watervliet or West Troy, which represented a shortcut to the Hudson rather than going all the way down to Albany. Um, this scene looks pretty bucolic, but Buffalo and Watervliet would gain the nicknames the Barbary Coasts of the East and West. Oops, sorry, because of their notorious reputations due to canalers carousing there. And the reason they become so notorious is because these are the two ends of the canal. Your average canal boats operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Um, Crews mainly just get to take a break and also get paid when they reach the end of their voyage. And typically, the majority of canal boats are traveling all the way across the state. So they're ending their voyages oftentimes in Buffalo and Watervliet. You usually have a few days off as they load or unload your canal boat. And that's also, like I said, when you get paid. And throughout history, sailors when they have shore leave and money in their pockets, tend to do a handful of things, which congregate around the port areas. Buffalo becomes very famous because the same process plays out on the Great Lakes as well. So Great Lake sailors end their voyage there as well. Um, the area around the Buffalo docks is at one point called the most sinful quarter mile in America. Um, if you are familiar with the song Buffalo Gals, that's about the red light district out in Buffalo. And Great Lakes sailors and canal sailors, canalmen, boaters, have a fierce rivalry amongst each other. They would often fight one another in those bars out in Buffalo. Meanwhile, out in Watervliet, a contemporary newspaper said that there were, quote, 100 fights a day and one body a week found in the canal. This was a rough and tumble area with bars that included names like the Bank and the Friendly Inn, which kind of disguised what they were a bit. But then others where, if you walked into, you were probably expecting to get into one of those 100 fights a week, like the Black Rag and my favorite, the Tub of Blood. Which is located here in Watervliet. You wouldn't tell from this postcard that nearby is a place called the Tub of Blood, but there was. Anyway, though, um, so people are definitely drinking a lot of the beer being made in these breweries. However, the Erie Canal also sparks a lot of other social changes. you have information able to move faster than ever before. Um, People are interacting with these new ideas as well as pe thousands of new people. And a lot of new ideas come out of the canal. You have the Second Great Awakening, which really takes hold along the canal. This religious revival movement that tells people that they can make themselves morally perfect as well as their society. And out of this spring a lot of different reform movements. The canal becomes famous for its abolitionist activism as well as women's rights activism, but also the temperance movement starts to take hold as people begin looking at their society and say, hey, it seems kind of bad that there are, 100 fights a day and a body a week found in the canal here in this town. This is sort of an issue. So temperance begins to grow more and more, starting in kind of the late 1820s and the 1830s. That report I mentioned, where the missionary found how many bars were located along the canal, was one of these missionary temperance societies kind of documenting the sin along the canal. Um, at first, temperance, at times, they're just pushing to drink less alcohol or later alcohol. If you'll remember, we started this talk out talking a lot about whiskey. Um, Early temperance advocates start saying maybe you should drink beer instead of whiskey. You'll get, less drunk at least, but you also start getting more people who want to abstain from alcohol. At first, it's mainly a personal choice, however. And you can see just like how those immigrant communities grew and businesses grew to cater their tastes. Likewise, you have places like the Home Temperance Restaurant that grow up in Syracuse to service people who don't want to consume alcohol, not be tempted at the tub of blood or something like that as well. So these sorts of places grow up, but eventually reformers will see that voluntarily convincing people to give up alcohol isn't enough. And you start seeing movements to create laws that will limit the amount of alcohol people can consume, um, or how expensive alcohol is, or make it harder to produce or sell. You have a series of blue laws that are enacted. The building where the Erie Canal is based in, the Waylock building, which is essentially a toll booth on the canal, it even plays a role in this. If you have a pro-temperance government in Albany, they could increase the tolls on things like barley or hops and hopefully raise the price of alcohol so people would purchase less of it. But another law that is passed in the 1870s says that in order to purchase alcohol at a bar, you also have to buy food. This upsets a number of tavern owners, especially in that canal side German neighborhood in Buffalo that we saw earlier. Um, these tavern keepers will think they're quite upset. The idea is you're going to buy less beer if you have to buy food. And that's where a lot of their profit comes from. So they're trying to think, how can we make people drink more alcohol? You know, and they think back to their traditional foodways in Germany of very salty roast beef, as well as sorry about my dog, the salt encrusted Kummelweck roll. And thus is born one of Western New York's most iconic dishes, the beef on wick, um, as a way for German canal side tavern keepers to get around some temperance laws. But as clever as that solution was, the temperance advocates kept pushing as well. And following the Civil War, um, temperance was connected to all of these other reform movements, abolition and women's rights. But after the Civil War, temperance and women's rights become very, very closely linked. Many women's rights advocates see a lot of connections to this rampant alcohol abuse in society and their demands for women's rights. Oftentimes, this is an era where men are the primary breadwinners in a lot of homes. If they are injured or die from alcohol-related accidents on the job, or in one of Watervliet's taverns or something, your family could be left destitute. Likewise, a lot of these folks who are going to the black rag or the tub of blood, they're not getting in those fights at the bars. They're often bringing them home. So it's also connected to domestic violence a lot as well. And you can see how closely linked women's rights and temperance are in 1919, as that year Congress passes both the 18th Amendment, which prohibits the production and sale of alcohol, and the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. Um, Prohibition will, of course, be devastating to breweries throughout the state. However, um, also, just about that time, a year earlier, in 1918, what you see pictured here opened up. This is the modern New York State barge canal system, which goes straight to the Canadian border, where alcohol was still nice and legal. So the barge canal is believed to have played a somewhat significant role in bootlegging throughout the 1920s. Um, but this still hurts a lot of breweries. Some breweries, we have evidence to show that they just kept trying to brew beer, whether it was legal or not. There's one brewery out in Rome that is busted by prohibition agents 5 different times for producing illegal beer. But many other breweries, the ones that don't close, will transition into a number of other, often drinking related industries, making things like ice or soda. Or they make near beers, which can either be non-alcoholic um, beers, essentially, or some of them make these little kits that have all the ingredients you need to produce beer, um, as well as instructions on the side that say, do not follow these steps or else you will produce illegal alcohol. Um, Solid way around that law. Um, One such brewery that makes this transition is that West End Brewing Company, founded by German immigrant FX Matz out in Utica. They transition into making a number of different products, including a club soda. FX Matt is supposed to have gotten some early warning that prohibition was going to be repealed in the early 1930s, and may or may not have told the folks making that club soda to change their production earlier than was necessarily legal to start making beer. And so, as their cans proudly still proclaim to this day, Utica Club becomes the first beer served after Prohibition. Um, and you would think that Prohibition's over, brewing in New York is back. And in some ways it is. A number of breweries will survive Prohibition, like West End. Out in Rochester, you have Genesee Brewing Company. In Syracuse, we actually have 5 different breweries make it through Prohibition. You have Greenways, Haberleys, Zetz, Bartels, and Morin Quinn. However, um, a lot of these companies won't last too long. Zetz closes in 1934, Bartels 1942, Morin Quinn closes in 1950, Greenways in 1953, and Syracuse would lose its final brewery in 1962. So what's happening here? Why are all of these breweries going out of business? They had been so successful. before Prohibition. And now that alcohol is legal again, you would think that they could be successful again. However, especially after kind of World War II, the economics of beer production are dramatically changed, especially in beer transportation as well. New technology like refrigerated railroad cars and pasteurization, that sort of thing, make it so the ideal place to produce beer is somewhere in the center of the country near rail lines with heavily capitalized, just massive firms. Places like Budweiser out in St. Louis. You've got all the breweries out in Milwaukee. Chicago has these huge breweries as well, and connections to rail lines. They had also, because they were based in kind of more far-flung sections of the country, less populated. Some historians believe that, because the Erie Canal creates this dense area of population in upstate New York and the Hudson River Valley in New York, a lot of these breweries could just produce beer for kind of local consumption and it was fine. A lot of these other breweries out west, they don't have that luxury. And so they produce and get into kind of national marketing earlier. But also this new technology makes it so a Budweiser made in St. Louis can theoretically taste about the same in San Francisco as it does in Boston as well. And they have a lot of money behind them as well. So a lot of these breweries are going under. They can't compete with these nationwide brands. Um, the only way for breweries to stay afloat is they have to innovate. Utica Club largely does this through advertising. Um, Most famously, they have their spokes mugs, Schultz and Dooley talking beer steins, which are hugely popular. In fact, Schultz and Dooley commercials are the only commercials ever listed in the TV guide because people needed to know when they were going to be on TV. Um, they also produce ad campaigns like this one from the 1960s. Utica Club is where it really swings. They were trying to act like they were a swinging like 60s nightclub. They even had their own psychedelic 45 that they came out with. It's a fun time. Um, so this keeps Utica Club and the West End Brewing Company afloat. Other breweries would innovate in terms of beer that they made. Um, Specifically, Genesee Brewing Company. It would come out with two groundbreaking beers. Genesee Cream Ale, which in 1960 won Best Beer in America at the American Beer Festival, which is shocking. That was what I drank in college for like $12 a 30 pack or something. But in the 1960s, that was about as good as you were getting. And Genesee also produces one of the earliest light beers, Jenny Light, um, which is a huge success as well. Jenny also has some relatively popular ad campaigns too. The Jenny Girl, for instance, while Utica Club would, also get into the cream ale and light beer game. They would also produce things like beer balls and Maximus Super, which is like the 1970s version of Four Loko, kind of. The best thing that happens for that is it's banned in Vermont for having too high of alcohol content, which makes it very popular afterwards. So these sorts of innovations keep these two breweries afloat while every other brewery goes under. Though this is a double-edged sword. Haverly's, which I said was the last brewery in Syracuse, they fail because they invest millions of dollars into this ad campaign that they think is going to be the next Schultz and Dooley. It's not. It's a huge flop. They can't pay back the loans they took out for it, and so they go under. And even by the late 70s, these two remaining pre-Prohibition era breweries, Genesee and West End, are struggling because these huge national breweries, they can produce light beers, they can make cream ales if they want to. They have enormous advertising budgets. They can produce things as good as, Schultz and Dooley and the Jenny Girl. You know, think about even today, the Budweiser Super Bowl commercial is like must-watch TV most of the time, right? Um, they have these giant ad, call it, budgets. So they're slowly starting to outcompete New York State breweries as well. And it's during this era that one of FX Matz's grandson travels to Germany and learns more about German beer production there. You also have in the 60s and 70s, a lot of cultural forces are making people start to think more about what they're purchasing and what they're consuming. Um, and so people apply this to beer too. A lot of them don't like, paying these giant like multinational corporations. They're also, like thinking about how the beer tastes, etc. There's a famous joke that they tell at the Utica Club Brewery that FX Matz went to dinner with Adolphus Coors and Adolphus Busch once. And when those two ordered their beers, um, FX Matz supposedly said, if everyone else is having water, I'll take one too. Um, hmm, Someone was able to doodle on this. That's fun. But anyway, FX Matz's grandson goes to Germany, tries their beer, learns a bit more about beer production out there, and comes back. He's had some delicious beer there, and he's aware of this growing craft brewing trend. And so in 1985, for the centennial of the West End Brewing Company's opening, they will come out with a new craft beer line that is Saranac. And this will save the brewery. They will also start contracting out to a lot of these early craft brewing companies. West End is the first brewery that contracts out for Sam Adams as well. So this keeps that brewery afloat. Genesee also does a ton of contracting as well. And in the 80s and then in the 90s, brewing really starts to take off. Syracuse would get its first brewery back 30 years after Haverly closes with the Syracuse Suds Factory. Shortly after that, it would be followed by Middle Ages Brewing Company. Um, this was back in the day when there weren't a lot of craft breweries. So if you were in Syracuse, you could just say, I kind of like knights and stuff. I'm gonna make my brewery themed after the Middle Ages. However, over time, as more and more craft breweries open, brewers began to focus more and more on their local audiences, connecting their beers to the history of their towns. And so in 1998, you have your first Erie Canal themed craft beer, at least that I could find. The Towpath line of beers produced by Relier Brewing in Syracuse. Again, starting in 98. But eventually, especially after the passage of the Farm Brewery Act in 2012 by New York State, which really opened up the ability for breweries um, to produce and sell beer profitably, you have a proliferation of breweries, and a lot of them will theme their entire brewery off of the Erie Canal. You have, for instance, Big Ditch out in Buffalo. You have Lock 32 in Pittsford. And then out in Canastota, you have the Erie Canal Brewing Company. And even this won't be enough for some brewers, many of whom really love history as well as challenging themselves to make new and unique beers. And a lot of breweries would have started to experiment with historic recipes going back to old breweries from the Canal corridor, including our friends at Willow Rock Brewing, who partnered with the Onondaga Historical Association to bring back Haverly Brewing Company's flagship beer, Congress. They actually found the historic um, recipe for it. And then in 2019, in that location we've gone back to multiple times, at the corner of Onondaga Creek and the Erie Canal, what is now Erie Boulevard in Syracuse, another brewery opened up, Talking Cursive Brewing Company. Um, a couple of years after that, in 2021, they were approached by an educator at the Erie Canal Museum who said, "Hey, do you guys know about like the history of your site? It's critical to Syracuse brewing history as well as Erie Canal brewing history." They did, but they ultimately would partner with the Erie Canal Museum to produce this beer, Good Old Pale Ale, which highlighted the history of this location. They tried to model it after historic Greenways ales, and it also helped support history education by providing the Erie Canal Museum with a small donation for every beer purchased as well. So, yeah. Um, finally, um, the Erie Canal played one more important role in modern New York State brewing history. In 2017, Genesee Brewing Company out in Rochester made a huge expansion. They needed these giant beer tanks, which were too large to be transported down the thruway or the railroad. So the only way to get them to Rochester was via canal barge, as you see here. Um, these were transported over the course of about a week from New York City up to Rochester and installed. If you enjoy beers like Genesee Ruby Red Kolsch, it's after these were installed um, that they start producing those smaller special batch beers out at Genesee. And yeah, so nowadays, we're back to kind of a new golden age in beer brewing along the canal. Though every time I give this talk at a brewery and talk about how they were making like 100,000 barrels a year at some of these places, we're not on the same scale. But yeah, there's the history of brewing along the canal, past, present, maybe a little of the future too. Who knows? Are there any questions?
Derek, I've got a few questions, but first let me say that I am incredibly thirsty right now.
Me too.
Yeah, but that was fascinating, and a very epic scale that I'm really impressed by. But and I've recently had some Genesee grapefruit Kolsch, and yeah, so now I've seen where it comes from the tanks it was brewed in. That's great.
Yeah.
Couldn't
I
ask for
actually
more.
think those tanks, I believe they mainly produce Smirnoff wine coolers, but they
Ah,
allowed they allowed other production facilities start
I'm
making.
sure they did. Yes. Well, but let me ask this. Where do you see the beer production in New York State along the canal going from here? You know, there's been so many craft breweries. It's almost kind of saturated the market and become a little overdone. And so I've been thinking, what's the next shoe to drop, or where's the industry headed in your view?
Yeah, I have definitely heard that from brewers that I've talked to that the industry has become pretty much saturated at this point. We've seen a lot of breweries go out of business, especially with the pandemic. Um, I've been noticing a lot of kind of consolidation of craft breweries. There's a lot, like for instance, the Aurora Brewing Company. They just opened up. They took over one of our craft brewery tap rooms here in Syracuse recently. Meanwhile, they also own a brewery out in Bushnell's Basin, right on the banks of the canal as well. So that's been the trend I've been seeing in a lot of breweries in New York is the good ones are expanding. Some of the ones that aren't as well run are going out of business and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, as you might expect. Well, I don't want to monopolize the questions. I'll let other people ask, but just one other question, and that is, um, is a I saw that Congress beer the traditional recipe. Could you have I don't know if you've ever had it, but is there a particular characteristic historic type of beer from the canal breweries that you could describe?
Sure. So like I said, there's different kind of ethnic groups that prefer different types of beer. So Congress was made by Haberle's, which was a German brewery. Almost all the German brewers are producing lager beers. Sometimes I'm disappointed when I buy a Congress. I'm like, oh, I just bought a like $7 Budweiser, essentially, because they're pretty similar beers.
Yeah, yeah.
But that good old pale ale that I showed you, that was so we worked with Talking Cursive. They really got into like studying what types of beers would be made. And
Hmm.
that it's not an IPA. It was just a pale ale, which is slightly different. It had less hops in it
Hmm.
because they didn't need the hops. Those were originally put in as preservatives. So,
Hmm.
yeah, they're they're these less hoppy kind of ales than what we're used to today at a lot of craft breweries, I think.
Ah, interesting. I'll have to try that.
Yeah.
Well, one last comment. When I was at Cornell, there was a course taught in the hotel school on wines and spirits, and one week we did strictly just did beer, and I will say that Jenny Cream Ale was the best of the six beers we had, hands down. I mean, blindfold test, but
Hey,
uh, uh,
me
good
and my
stuff.
roommates in college would agree. We had our rankings of the cheap beers, and we were like,
Yeah,
could do a
yeah,
lot worse than a Jenny Cream.
sure could. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Alexis, I there was a question that popped up
Oh,
on the screen and I don't see it. Oh, okay, there we go. Um, this is from
ABV.
Kathleen and can you read that, dear?
Yep, I see. Have historians discovered the ABV values of beers brewed in the 1800s? That is a good question. I believe a lot of the beers had lower ABVs. You'll often read these kind of accounts of people just drinking beer all day, in a lot of cases. And I believe it's assumed that they were of lower ABVs than what we're used to at times. Don't quote me on that though.
Anybody else? No?
Yeah,
Okay, well, dear.
I have a quick question if that's all right. Um,
Sure.
I was just wondering if any of the buildings, I mean, obviously, probably not those gigantic breweries that were around in the 1800s are still in existence, but are there any buildings that are still, at least partially part of those breweries that extend either from, Albany or Syracuse or Buffalo, that you
Um,
know of?
yeah. Well, I'm sure that some of the smaller breweries they're around, but I just haven't seen them. Um, Actually, the foundation, the if you go into the basement of Talking Cursive, interestingly, they still have the old canal walls from the brewery.
Wow.
Sadly, Syracuse just lost um, one of its last remaining bits of that history. Um, Bartell's, that brewery that was on the other side of the canal from Greenways, their cold storage building was standing until about 4 months or so. It had started to collapse, and they've fully torn the building down now. Um, Utica Club is still made in the old historic building as well, mostly. But yeah, those are a few of the examples I can think of. A lot of other breweries, like I said, a lot of these breweries have been harkening back to history, and many have opened up in historic buildings. There are a ton located in old train stations. Um, I was just at one recently, so that's cool.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
Well, thank you. Um, one more plug before I go too. Um, if you are interested, the Erie Canal Museum itself hosts talks at least once a month that are all broadcast on Zoom, as well as in person at the museum. You also get recordings of them afterwards. So highly recommend considering signing up for our Sloan lecture series. We have some really interesting speakers coming.
I would say if you get yourself to Syracuse, make sure you get downtown and see the Canal Museum, and get to say hello to Derrick and learn some more about the construction of this marvelous thing that influenced the development of the area that we all love. Thank you so much, Derek. It was really wonderful. Everyone, I'm still playing with the schedule for January 14th a little bit, but that will be our first uh, presentation of the new year. So stay tuned, and we will send you the details soon. And in the meantime, I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday season celebrating whatever it is you celebrate. You might want to celebrate with a little bit of beer.
There we go.
Okay,
Always makes
so
for a
we
good
can
celebration.
say goodnight then, I think.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Take care.